Varmt välkomna till Hjärnskakningspodden där vi diskuterar allt som har att göra med just hjärnskakningar. Jag delar med mig av information, erfarenheter och intervjuer där vi diskuterar det här ämnet. Mitt namn är Viktor Bull. Jag är legitimerad fysioterapeut med särskilt intresse för just hjärnskakningar. Och kom ihåg att innehållet i den här podden inte ersätter bedömning av legitimerad sjukvårdspersonal. Då vill jag hälsa varmt välkommen forskare från Sahlgrenska i Göteborg, Fernando Gonzales. Och den här intervjun kommer också bli i engelska. Vi har haft några intervjuer här på engelska på sistone. Och hoppas ni står ut med det. Jag vet att många av lyssnarna har stått ut med det tidigare i alla fall. Och Fernando träffade jag, eller lyssnade på när jag var uppe på idrottsmedicinska vårmötet i år 2025. Och där pratade Fernando väldigt mycket kring just blodmarkörer. Alltså hur man mäter olika typer av skador som sker mot hjärnan vid till exempel hjärnskakningar med hjälp av blodet och lite andra typer av mätmetoder. Men first and foremost, Fernando, warm welcome to the Hjärnskakningspodden.
Thank you so much. I understood all the things that you said. So
perfect.
So thank you for the kind introduction.
And why is it, Fernando, that we are that you understand Swedish? You are a scientist in Gothenburg. Please tell us who are you and where did your career start?
I think that's a long story. I think that I ended up in Sweden just by accident. I had no plans and I didn't know anything about Sweden, Gothenburg or Stockholm when I moved here. But yes, I'm a medical doctor with a residency in internal medicine. And I've been traveling around. I mean, part of my formation was also in Scotland. Then I moved to Stockholm in 2018. And then I applied for a position at Sahlgrenska and Gothenburg University in 2021, where basically I was meant to work with Professor Kai Bleno on new blood biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. But then since my training is medical and my formation is mostly in internal medicine, I didn't think that staying with Alzheimer's disease only would be a nice fit for me. So I've been working on different neurological conditions.
Can imagine. And when you do a search on you on, for example, PubMed, then you find a lot of articles, and many of them is connected to Alzheimer's research. But when we met, or when we listened to you in Gothenburg, it was on the subject of concussion. And I can remember you were first lecturer that conference, and I think they gave you a too small room to lecture in because it was cramped. People had trouble fitting inside.
Yeah.
But please tell us, how did it come to be that you were a lecturer on concussion and blood biomarkers?
That is a funny story, at least for me, because so originally it was my boss, Professor Kai Bleno, who was supposed to give a lecture there. But then, professors are usually super busy and they have always problems with schedules. So he told me would you like to give a talk in these conferences? And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And I obviously asked what is the topic? But he just briefly mentioned I think it's mostly about acute injury, TBI and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, sure, that's not a problem. So then I got in touch with the organizing committee, and then I sent a proposal that I would like to talk about acute neuronal injury across different conditions, mostly stroke, TBI. But they told me this has to be related to sports. And I was like, okay, that makes things a bit more complicated. But then I think I can give a 15 minutes lecture on acute neural injury in sports. But they told me it's a 45 minutes lecture. So you better come up with something that will be enough for that. So, I mean, it was basically because Kai couldn't give this lecture, and then I never asked too many questions when it comes to this. I was like, yeah, sure, let's do that. But then they told me the whole thing behind it, and that's how I ended up giving that lecture.
And you said you had to come up with enough material for it, but I know that you were almost short of breath at the end because you had so much to tell us that day.
The thing is that when it comes to sports-related concussion and TBI in like sports, I don't have a point. I mean, I obviously can present things that other people have published, but I always like to present things that I have done because those are the things that I know and then I can share. And if people have questions about the methodology or something, it is easier to explain those things. But in the end, I decided to start with like general stuff about sports-related concussion and then maybe just focus more on the blood-based biomarker aspect. So.
And I know that after your lecture, it was great. And many people was talking about it. It was it created many discussions afterwards about how you should not maybe treat concussions in the clinic, but how you should think about returning to sport and when ending a career and things like that. But for the listeners, I used to call it the elevator pitch. If you only had a short amount of time to tell us the most important things, what are blood biomarkers in regards to concussion, and what should everybody know within that field? Okay, so I would put it like this. So blood biomarkers are basically signatures or are basically just proteins that will tell us when something is wrong with the brain, but this applies to many conditions. So in terms of blood biomarkers related to sports or sports-related concussion, what we need to know is that these brain biomarkers that we can measure in blood are very good, but they are not always very specific. So then we always need to take things in context. So right now with new technologies, we can definitely measure proteins that 20 years ago, we thought it was impossible to measure in blood, but that doesn't mean that we are already there when it comes to like assessing brain injury just with blood-based biomarkers. So they are great, but there's still a lot of a way to go. Can imagine. But when you get just for listeners, when you get a concussion, when you get a hit to the head, what is it? These biomarkers, where do they come? Is it a part of the nerve cells, or what is it that you're measuring?
That is an excellent question, because when it comes to biomarkers, I would say it's a bit like real estate. It's all about location. And then, so these biomarkers that we measure in blood, so basically after a concussion, depending on the severity of the concussion, most of the things that you measure in blood that are expressed in the brain will be elevated. So it doesn't matter, like, even if you have like very amounts of this protein in physiological conditions in blood, if you measure after traumatic brain injury or concussion, most likely these proteins will be high. And the reason why is because these proteins are physiologically expressed in the brain. So when we think about biomarkers, we tend to believe that these are things that appear after like a pathological process, like concussion, Alzheimer's or something. But one thing that we always need to keep in mind is that all these proteins that we measure have physiological roles. All of them, they are there for a reason. They are not there just to say, hey, there's like Alzheimer's pathology in the brain. So they have a physiological reason to be there. So the idea behind these biomarkers in sports-related concussion is that they are normally expressed in the brain, and depending on like the severity of the injury, these biomarkers will be more or less expressed in will be able to be measured in blood. So as you said, like they are located not only in neurons, but also in other types of cells, like astrocytes. So they normally are expressed in these cells, and under physiological conditions, the values in blood are very, very low or almost unmeasurable. But once you have a pathological process like concussion or Alzheimer's disease, they start to increase in blood.
So what you're saying is that we're not just seeing them when it's an injury. They do have a very important function in a healthy brain as well.
Exactly.
So could you say that these biomarkers that you're measuring, when these proteins, when they are doing their job, then they are part, it's like a house, different parts of the nerve cells. Could you explain that? Where do these markers fit, and where do we find them in a healthy brain?
Yeah, so I would put it like this. So normally when you enter a house or a building, you don't see the blocks because you have painting and you have a bunch of things covering the blocks or the bricks in the building. But they are there, and they are basically what they are putting the whole thing together. But then when you have an explosion inside of the building, you will see a bunch of things, including the building blocks. So it's something like that what happens with the blood biomarkers after TBI. So many things that you don't normally see in blood because they are in the brain, and then they normally either stay in the brain or they are just released to blood in very small amounts. You won't see them. It won't be that obvious. But when you have like a traumatic brain injury or concussion, it's like an explosion. So everything will be released to blood. And also something that we need to understand is that once they are released, they need to be cleared from peripheral blood. So there are many pathways in which these biomarkers can be clear, like kidney, liver. They will do they will function in different ways to actually start to clear all these proteins or all these things that are released from the brain. So normally you shouldn't see these things because they are there having their own physiological role. But then in many conditions, this happens. And also sometimes, this is maybe more like a side note, and this is more in neurodegenerative diseases. We actually don't know what these biomarkers mean when they increase, because one idea that sometimes we have is that, okay, when this protein increases is because this is really bad. This protein is bad. And I can give you the example of phospho-tau that maybe some of your listeners know because it has become such a trendy thing in the field that when you listen about blood biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, you're mostly hearing about phospho-tau. And then it's like, well, phospho-tau is related to the rate of decline in individuals with Alzheimer's disease. It's really bad that you have really high levels. But funny thing, in newborns, so far we have explored different conditions, physiological and pathological conditions. Newborns are the individuals that have the highest concentrations of phospho-tau in the blood. Why? Because phospho-tau physiologically helps to build synaptic connections. So then we don't know the reason why phospho-tau is increased in Alzheimer's disease. We have some ideas that it might be related to amyloid or to other pathological processes. But in my mind, it could be more like a reactive process. When you have neurodegeneration, your neurons try to generate or regenerate the synaptic connections, and for that you need phospho-tau to be present. So we still don't know many things about these biomarkers, but something that I always say is, please remember that they have a physiological role. They are there to fulfill a role, and then what happens sometimes is that pathological processes or like acute injury just make them be released in like higher amounts. So that's what I would like to say about that.
And that's very nuanced because if you would just look at it very simplistic, then it would be like, well, they are main building blocks of the nerve cells, like the building blocks of a building. And when you get a hit to the head, these building blocks disappear or gets damaged, and then there has to be a cleanup. And that's why you find it in, for example, the cerebrospinal fluid or in blood. But as what you mentioned was that that's maybe not the only thing. Maybe the increased amount of these building blocks in blood maybe is due to a reaction to the injury and not only the injury itself. Is that how you should interpret it?
Exactly. Yeah. So then I think that it's not a straightforward path in this case. So the main reason why we see this massive release of biomarkers immediately after the injury is because, of course, you have neuronal death, and then with neuronal death comes the release to all these biomarkers. But then after a while, you have a physiological process that starts to clean and rebuild the whole thing. So that's why even I think I've shown some of this data in the presentation that even after a year, some of these markers can still remain high. Why? Because the process of cleaning, of rebuilding is not done yet. So this is also why it's so important to monitor or use these markers to monitor the brain health and brain injury, because it can give us an idea of like, okay, so if the marker is not fully back to normal, it means that the process is still there, even if the patient looks like completely okay. So that is why it's important.
And when people hear this, they probably, just as me, think about the word inflammation, inflammatory process as a cleanup after injury. Is this a part of what you could call inflammatory process, or is this something else?
I think that inflammation is a very general term, and I don't know a single physiological disease or like organic disease that doesn't have inflammation. So inflammation is such a general process that it's basically many different things can cause inflammation. But I would say that, yeah, inflammation is a big part of this, but also we have to think in a way that when you have a massive release of these biomarkers, when you have neuronal death, there's also a dysregulation in the metabolism of these proteins. So proteins that would be produced, have a function, and then be destroyed and cleared, when you have this TBI or concussion, there will be a dysregulation in this metabolism. So then part of the process apparently is not only inflammation, but it's a way to go back to normal. Again, if you want to see it like, again, the example with the building, it's not only clearing the mess, but it's starting to put new bricks back to create a new building. So it's inflammation, yeah, but that is a very general process. But there is also this process of like the metabolism of these proteins need to go back to normal, and that takes time.
So regardless of calling it inflammation or not, it's a building back the building process, so to say. And that's what we also see in the blood or the cerebrospinal fluid.
Exactly. Yes. So I think that if we take this approach of understanding the physiological role of these proteins more than just calling them like biomarkers, because biomarker always has this connotation of like there is something wrong. So high means bad, but high might just means like rebuilding.
I understand. And it makes sense when you're putting it that way. But for the listeners to understand, when we talk about we'll keep calling them biomarkers.
Sure.
So what you actually want to do, you want to measure what has happened in the brain and how much. Is that how you can say it?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that we have with these biomarkers that we also need to explain maybe is that, again, if we go back to location, so these biomarkers that we measure in blood, when you have a traumatic brain injury, usually the high levels that you observe are because there's neuronal injury and release of these markers. But also we need to address that these biomarkers are not exclusive of the brain, so they are also peripherally expressed. So the reason why we have so many candidates for a traumatic brain injury, for example, is that if you measure any kind of protein immediately after the injury, all of them will be high. But the problem is that when you measure something in blood, you also need to take in consideration that you are measuring also peripheral stuff. So you have many different markers. For example, tau. I spoke a lot about tau in the presentation. That is highly expressed in the brain, but it's also highly expressed in other tissues. So what happens when you measure tau in blood, even after TBI, is that you are measuring a combination of like peripheral and brain tau. So that makes difficult to assess like, okay, how big the change is in relation to the brain tau. So then I would say like high usually means increased released, but also could mean like many different things.
So that's what you're looking for is something that is the most specific for a brain injury. So for if you have a biomarker that is increased a lot during regular exercise, then that wouldn't be the best biomarker for a brain injury. Is that how you should put it?
Exactly. So I would say that we are looking for biomarkers that are, one, brain specific or as specific as possible, and two, that show a specific that doesn't show a lot of variation. Because also when it comes to biomarkers, one thing that is becoming more important with all these publications that are published every day is that these biomarkers are not stable. Like it's not like you have a value of 1 in the morning and then a value of 1 at night or something like that. But they have a circadian rhythm. So there are changes over the day, over the course of the day. And then this also could affect the way we read and interpret the markers. I would say that, for example, in traumatic brain injury, it's not such a big problem because the increases would be so high that it will be obvious that the change is there. It becomes more challenging for conditions like Alzheimer's disease, where, for example, the increases of phospho-tau could be in normal patients is 1, in patients with Alzheimer's disease is 3 or 4, which is like, oh, it sounds like a lot. But if you take in consideration that there might be variations with different factors, it is difficult to interpret these results. So then I would say that, we are looking for biomarkers that are as brain specific as possible, but also that show less variation when we measure that in patients.
Nice way to put it. But when it comes to these building blocks, because there are a few that are mostly published and talked about. You have, for example, tau, as you mentioned, but you also have the building block or biomarker neurofilament light,
Yes.
the GFAP. Just to get a sense of it, what is the difference between these, if I call them popular or most talked about, the building blocks, and what is the difference in how you can and should measure it?
Yeah, that is an excellent question because, again, we go back to the point of location. So GFAP is such a good marker, and it has become really, really popular in many fields. GFAP is a very, very interesting biomarker because if you go to the Alzheimer's field, they will tell you like, oh, GFAP is amazing. It's a marker of astrocyte activation to amyloid pathology. If you go to ALS, to MS, GFAP is also such a great biomarker because it also can predict clinical outcome or severity. So it has many different functions and when it comes to its role as a biomarker. So many different fields can use it. In stroke, for example, GFAP seems to be the best predictor of conversion from ischemic to hemorrhagic stroke. So it is such a versatile biomarker, but I would say that GFAP is not necessarily a specific marker of something. So the difference between GFAP and tau and NFL, for example, is that GFAP is more a marker of astrocytes. And astrocytes are a special type of cell within the brain. And also they are strongly associated to what we call the blood-brain barrier. So the astrocytes are some of these cells that are forming what we call the blood-brain barrier. So that makes GFAP such a unique biomarker because not only is sensitive to many changes. So when there's like a pathological process, for example, related to the position of some proteins like amyloid, GFAP or the astrocytes react very early to the amyloid in the brain. So the levels of GFAP increase quite early in the disease continuum. But GFAP can also be increased due to vascular changes in the brain, due to like blood-brain barrier disruption or many other things. So I would say that it is a great biomarker, but the location is key in this context because since this is a biomarker of astrocytes can be activated due to many different reasons. So that would be GFAP. In a concussion in traumatic brain injury, GFAP is great because, again, it captures different aspects of TBI. Not only it captures the inflammation part, but it also captures the neuronal death or the that is related to the concussion, and also captures the blood-brain barrier disruption in these patients. So that's why when you measure GFAP, depending on the method that you use, levels are usually very, very, very high. And then these levels seem to be stupidly high, normally correlate quite well with clinical outcome and with severity of the injury. Because again, due to its nature and origin, it seems like GFAP captures different aspects of TBI. So that would be GFAP. And when it comes to
could I just
yeah.
Because for the listeners, this is great, by the way. But
Sorry.
for them to understand, could we just tell them the difference between the nerve cells, the glia cells, which the astrocytes are part of, and what is this blood-brain barrier that, and what does this mean when you measure different things?
Yeah, so basically in the brain we have different types of cells, and then the ones that do the trick, it's obviously neurons. Those are the ones that we are mostly familiar with, and then I think we all have seen illustrations of neuron with its different parts, and then those are the cells that generate the synaptic connections between them, and basically, again, do the trick that the brain and make the brain work as it works. But also we have some support cells. So we have other cells that help the brain to keep like physiological conditions. So conditions where it can function properly. So among these cells, we have different types, but one that is quite particular is astrocytes that serve some kind of like immunological mediator in the brain. So in the central nervous system, we don't have like immune system like in the rest of the body. So we depend on other types of cells. In this case, we depend on a type of cell that is called astrocytes. And then these astrocytes, as you mentioned, are strongly associated to inflammation. So these are the cells that when there is something damaging the brain, it can be acute or chronic, these astrocytes will react to that. And they are usually very sensitive and very efficient at dealing with many different processes. So it is like, those are the cells that when you have a TBI, they have to clean the mess after the injury. So they are quite active in very early stages, but they also stay until late stages because they need to clean and make sure that the brain goes back to physiological mode. So these are the type of cells that are, let's say, supportive of neurons. And then one of the important things that these cells also do is that the blood-brain barrier, I always imagine it like as, I don't know, like as a capsule or a barrier or like something physical. But the blood-brain barrier is actually the junction between cells, like the distance between cells that allow the movement of molecules between blood and central nervous system or cerebral spinal fluid in this case. And the idea of the blood-brain barrier is that it is composed by different types of cells that it can extend or shorten the gap between these unions. And some of the key cells working in creating the blood-brain barrier is the astrocytes. So the astrocytes are supportive of neurons, but they are also supportive of these other structures, like the blood-brain barrier. So if I have to put it that way, in a simple way, the blood-brain barrier is the space between different cells, and this space can be enlarged or shortened depending on like different things.
So could you say, if we use the building analogy, that the building and building blocks is the neurons, or what people are familiar with, the nerve cells of the brain, and the supporting cells, for example, astrocytes, are the gardeners, the guards of the house. They are helping. They are taking out the trash cans, but they are also allowing who is allowed to come in to the building and who is not. Is that how you should put it?
I would say that if you want to imagine the brain again as a building, you have the structure, the building blocks, and those are the neurons. But then you also have the furniture. You have things that need to be there in order for the building to be functional. So you have the furniture that you might say like, wow, but it's not that important, but it could actually be really important. It is really important. So I would say that you have, in addition to the building blocks, you also have these other structures that are supportive of the function. So those are I would call, for example, the astrocytes. And then when there is like, again, this explosion or this damage to the building, you have different type of instruments that could be part of the furniture that will help to rebuild and clean stuff and put things back to normal.
A good way to put it. But you mentioned that GFAP is is a very popular marker when it comes to neurodegeneration, MS, ALS, for example. But you wanted to talk about some other market because GFAP maybe is not the best for concussion, is it? Or what is your opinion on that?
I mean, the thing with GFAP again is that, as I mentioned, like it's such a good marker because it captures different aspects of the pathology. But the problem of that is that if you measure GFAP in blood and after traumatic brain injury and it is extremely elevated, it could be that the neuronal injury is not that severe, but there's a big vascular affection. Or it could be that there's a big blood-brain barrier disruption with not exactly a lot of neuronal or brain injury. So what I've seen in the studies that we have run and then where we have used GFAP is that overall, GFAP is a great marker predicting clinical outcomes. However, it is difficult to say how severe the injury is just based on GFAP because it could be more related to vascular things, it could be related more to neuronal death, or it could be related to just inflammation in general, like a big response. So it's good as a clinical outcome marker, but I would say, as with all the other conditions that use GFAP, it is not specific. So that is one of the limitations. So it's the good side and the bad side of GFAP. It's such a good marker, such an early marker, makes a lot of things, captures a lot of aspects, but difficult to pinpoint exactly what is reflecting at a specific time.
So it could be increased because of damage to the neurons, but not only the neurons, also the blood-brain barrier.
Exactly.
And so it's hard, and the vascular system. So it's hard to know which system is affected just by seeing the level increase of GFAP. Is that how you should?
Yes, exactly. So and then another thing is that one important aspect of this when you measure these biomarkers in blood is not only like, okay, they are all increased during like the first 24 hours, but also how quickly they get clear from peripheral blood. And then because, for example, one thing that we want also with a blood biomarker for TBI is that I want to get information from the marker not only at admission, but I want to get information of the marker after treatment and then days after the incident. Because if I have a marker that is super valuable, but it is only valuable at admission, what happens if I don't capture the patient or if I don't manage to measure the biomarker at admission because of whatever reason? So then at 24 hours, maybe it's not that useful anymore. So an important thing is like not only how high it is at admission, but how long it remains high and how effective it is reflecting the effectiveness of my treatment. So those are the things that I would consider important in a blood biomarker.
So how long it takes for it to increase, but also how long for it to decrease and what it means if it stays increased.
Yeah, exactly. And even if, let's say, if you measure the biomarkers, let's say if you measure GFAP after 7 days, and it is still increased, what we want to know is if those increases are still clinically meaningful. Because, for example, maybe with some biomarkers, it will take 15 days, a month to go back to normal. But let's say that I want to measure these biomarkers a week or 2 weeks after the incident, and they are still high. Do I still get clinical information of like who is in a more severe state, who has an active injury, or who's just in the process of remission? So those kind of things are important. So we need to evaluate increases, but also trajectories.
That's a good point. We're going to discuss that later when it comes to decisions for returning to play for athletes, for example. But you had also not the GFAP, but you also mentioned we mentioned tau and neurofilament light. Tell us more about those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, with tau is really easy because, as I mentioned, people in Gothenburg or people in the AD field are obsessed with tau. And I mean, I totally get it. I was also not a fan when I started here, and I was like, how can someone be obsessed with just one protein? It is, but The thing with tau is that it is a fascinating protein. I think it's such a fun thing to study. So I think it's super fun to study tau. But also, it is also a protein that is quite meaningful. It provides a lot of information in so many different contexts. And then you have different forms of tau, phosphorylated and non-phosphorylated. Again, tau has become extremely popular recently because there are so many press releases about articles saying that in Alzheimer's disease, you have this amazing biomarker that is super accurate and it is basically perfect in blood. I have my reservations on that, but what I can say is that definitely tau is a very valuable biomarker. So tau and neurofilament light are mostly associated with neurons. And in the case of tau, you can have phosphorylated tau and non-phosphorylated tau. That's what we call total tau. So phosphorylated tau, again, serves a very important physiological role. In neurodevelopment, tau, again, is one of the main building blocks of neurons. And then in order to neurons, let's say that in order for the building to be built, you need first to have some flexibility. You need to put blocks in different ways. So you need to move blocks around, right? So you cannot just have the whole building already done. So you need to move the blocks around. So during neurodevelopment, there is high levels of phosphorylated tau that actually facilitate the movement of axons to generate synaptic connections. The non-phosphorylated form of tau is a less flexible form of tau, so it means that it stays rigid in the brain. So what happens with tau is that you can measure it either as a phosphorylated form, which in adults is very low abundant, and almost not be able to be measured with standard methods in blood. And then you have the non-phosphorylated form that is a bit more abundant. And usually what happens is that the levels of non-phosphorylated tau are associated with not only neurodegeneration, but severity of neuronal damage. So because it's more a neuronal marker, when you have increased levels of tau, these are usually more reflective of neuronal injury, more than GFAP, for example. And neurofilament light is a bit similar, but in the case of neurofilament light, it is mostly associated to the axons of the neuron. And so tau is also an axonal marker, but then when it is released to blood, it provides information of neurons and neuronal soma and axons. With NFL is more a white matter or axonal injury markers. So those are two markers that we measure quite a lot, not only in traumatic brain injury, but a lot also in Alzheimer's disease.
So when you get a head trauma and these neurons get damaged, then the point that you're making is that both neurofilament light and tau are two of the building blocks of the neurons that could be measured. But as you said, that tau is also a good marker for Alzheimer's disease. And this can sound scary to people because people are worried that if they get too many concussions, then maybe the risk of Alzheimer's will increase, and maybe it does. But there is no we don't know how much. The only thing we know that it's not good to get. But what would you say to those people?
That is an excellent point. There is actually a condition that has recently, or maybe not so recently, I just heard it recently, that is AD-TBI. So Alzheimer's disease after TBI. Because as I mentioned during the conference, what happens is that if a person gets repetitive injuries, and then again, one key aspect is that if there is not like a normalization stage, that let's say that you don't give enough time to the brain to recover, then we go back to this point of inflammation, but also to the dysregulation of the metabolism. So let's say that if someone gets consistent injuries, or even if they are not severe, but even if you have just mild injuries and you don't have time to recover, it seems that it's not only inflammation, but something happens to certain proteins, in this case tau and amyloid, that starts to show some deposition in the brain. So it's like, in a way, you are kind of inducing what would happen in pathological conditions like Alzheimer's disease. So there is a change in the way these proteins are used and transformed within the neurons that lead to a pathological change. So there is for sure an increased risk in individuals that have these repetitive concussive events, but also, as I said, it is a matter of like the intensity and the time that you have between these events. So it's true in that case.
So for a person who only had one concussion in their entire life is not the one to be most worried, but maybe the people who have repetitive head injuries over and over and over again, maybe during a very intense athletic career.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, Alzheimer's is not the only thing that we should worry about in this case, because even if there is only one event, depends on the severity of this event. And this could lead to, for example, vascular changes that are more permanent, and that could lead to the development of certain neurodegenerative diseases in the future. So I would say that, yeah, definitely AD is strongly associated to these repetitive events, but then also if the event is very severe and there is only just one time, there's also a possibility that other mechanisms are in play in this case.
So to say, the more often you get these head injuries, but also the more intense the head injuries is, the risk potentially increases, because what you are doing, as you said, you're inducing a process that could lead to neurodegenerative diseases in the future.
Exactly. And also a key aspect of this is, again, like how often do you get these events, how intense they are, and the time that you have between these events to recover. So in that sense, I think it's also quite important to have biomarkers that accurately reflect different aspects of this process, because I think that I don't believe on like just having one biomarker that does everything, but I think that it is more realistic to have a panel of biomarkers saying like, okay, Tau and NFL reflect different aspects of neurodegeneration, but they are more centered in the neuronal effects of TBI. Then you have GFAP covering many different aspects. So in a way, what we should aim for is not only just, okay, this is the one and only biomarker that you should use, but it's like a panel of biomarkers. And we do that a lot in medicine. By the way, I always bring this example that you have liver function panel, and with liver function panel, you have different markers reflecting different aspects of liver physiology and pathology. And then you don't say like, oh, I just want this biomarker for liver. No. It's like, I want the whole panel just to have a better overview of what is happening.
That's a very good way to put it. So you are looking not just for one, but many different kinds of markers that could tell you different things about which structures that has been injured.
Exactly. And I think that you mentioned something that is essential, because right now we have many different markers. You have many different articles saying like, oh, we managed to measure this thing, we managed to measure that thing. So you can measure a bunch of things with the technology that we currently have, and you will even be able to measure even more with new technologies. But the idea is that you should have a panel of biomarkers in which each biomarker represents a different thing, because you can have like 20 different biomarkers, but if all of them give you the exact same information, there is no point on measuring all of those. Just choose the one that performs the best. But what you want is a panel that reflects different things, that each biomarker provide a valuable piece of information.
That's a good way to put it. And so far we talk about GFAP, tau, and neurofilament light. But in our clinic, we often meet patients who've had concussion injuries, and they tell us that when they went to the emergency department, they say that they only took a blood sample. They didn't do an X-ray. They didn't really understand how could it be that only a blood sample could tell if you should have a CT or not. And I think that many of the listeners would think that is it tau or NFL they're measuring, but it's not. It's something called serum 100B. Could you tell us more about that, and why hasn't that been mentioned so far as a good concussion marker if they use it in the emergency department.
I mean, I think that also with the involvement of technology, what you thought that it was the best thing at some point, it becomes kind of obsolete. So I don't think that S100B is a bad biomarker, but I think that also it's an astrocyte biomarker. It's strongly associated to astrocytes. So I think that what has happened is that with new publications showing that GFAP is also an astrocyte marker and it performs really good, maybe what happens is that we are observing a transition from like the old school biomarkers to this new gen of biomarkers. So I haven't seen many articles with S100B, but there are a couple of publications actually showing that GFAP and S100B are equally good when it comes to predicting clinical outcomes in patients with TBI. But I would say that maybe GFAP has more advantages because of many other reasons, like stability or like the way the type of assays that they use to measure these biomarkers. So I think that it is a combination of things. And again, if you look for papers on blood biomarkers in traumatic brain injury, there are many proteins that you have never heard of, but they happen to be able to measure this. So I think that's what happens.
Is it also due to the very short half-life of serum 100B that you have, if you want it to work, you have to measure it in blood quickly after the brain injury? It's not for the chronic state or many days and weeks after, or is it?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, like it's not only measuring the increase of the marker at admission, but also evaluating the trajectory of the marker. So again, all the markers that you imagine that come from the brain will be high during TBI, but then not many of them will remain high. And most importantly, not all of them will provide clinically meaningful information after admission.
But when it comes to all these biomarkers, you say that most of them will be increased after head injury, but how should we use it? Because I know that for many years they've been talking about we want a sideline evaluation. We want like take the boxer or football player off the pitch, do a blood or blood sample and tell if this was a concussion or not. I know we're not there, but could there be a scenario for any of these markers to be used as a sideline rule in or rule out evaluation?
Absolutely. I think that it's only a matter of waiting a bit for technology to be more efficient in certain ways, like having quick measurements of these biomarkers, like quantitative measurements of this marker in a fast way. I would say like never say never, especially never bet against technology because you will lose for sure. I mean, if like, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would have said like, it is impossible to have a blood biomarker for Alzheimer's disease in blood. It is just not possible. But nowadays, I mean, it is pretty much possible to do that. So then I would say never bet against technology. I agree with the point that maybe we are not there in terms of like the methods that we have, like the platforms that we have available. I think that in my mind, the best case scenario is that you need to have a baseline measurement of the boxer, for example, before the match. And then if you want to evaluate, like, if there's like a severe injury or something, then you can have a measurement at the moment. But it is important that one thing that we don't have, for example, with traumatic brain injury in the emergency room, we don't have baseline measurements of the patient that comes to the clinic. We just need to get reference values for like, okay, what is normal in a group level, and then we see. But I mean, if you are planning to use this in like sports, definitely I think that there should be some guidelines and baseline levels so that can help us to get an objective view of how high is the biomarker in these scenarios.
It's nice to hear because some people have been very skeptical of it ever being using a sideline. But for it to be used sideline, for example, it takes, from what I understand, it takes time for the building blocks, let's say tau or neurofilament light, to leave the area of the injury in the brain, and it has to travel all the way out into the blood for then to be measured. And for it to travel out, it also have to get through the blood-brain barrier. So there, it's not instantly that the building blocks are can be measured through blood. But how long does it take for this to reach the blood for us to measuring it sideline in the future?
That is an excellent question. And it is also one of the things that we are wondering about, not exactly in terms of concussion, but for example, these biomarkers are extremely valuable in stroke. And we have a couple of studies because with stroke, you're betting against time. Like the sooner you capture a patient with acute ischemic stroke, the sooner you can start like treatment and the better chances they have to recover. So we have a study that is called ultra early differentiation between acute ischemic stroke and hemorrhagic stroke, where basically patients got blood samples taken in the ambulance. So even before they reach the hospital, and there was like this criteria of like, okay, the start of symptoms shouldn't be more than 2 hours. So basically very, 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 very early in the event. So we have seen that even like before admission at the ambulance, these biomarkers are increased. And this is something that we didn't mention. Tau is also superior in this sense because tau increases almost immediately, or what seems to be almost immediately after the injury, while NFL is a marker that has a different trajectory. So for NFL to significantly increases, it takes time. So it won't show like as a clear pattern compared to tau, because it might take a couple of hours, sometimes even a day, to actually show significant increases. And what we have seen is that in the context of acute neuronal injury, NFL reaches its peak around 7 days. So meaning that it goes up very slowly, which makes it a good biomarker because then you can also evaluate the trajectory of NFL. But tau seems to increase quite early after an injury. Now, how quick it increases after like a concussion in sports-related terms, I'm not sure. We don't have that data yet, but I would definitely like to know more about that.
So the mission is to find a marker that could be measured quickly, that were very quickly could be evaluated in blood. And when it comes to tau and neurofilament light, it leans to the tau side of it, if I understand you correctly, even though we don't know how quickly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have taken consideration that I'm super biased here because basically my whole research is based on tau. So I always will promote tau first. But it is also because I truly believe that it is such a good biomarker in these scenarios. The thing that we don't have yet, not that I know, is like a way to measure these biomarkers in a quantitative way in an acute scenario. There are some talks and there are some projects that aim to have like a point of care for markers like tau. But then we are still in these very early stages. Obviously, the way that we do it right now is that we use these instruments that take around 2 hours to measure the samples. So this is not useful in a clinical context or like in acute scenarios like this, where you want to take the blood during the match, get the results, and then decide. I think we are not there yet, but for sure, in the coming years, I wouldn't be surprised if these biomarkers find a place in sports.
But even though not having a place in sideline evaluation today or yet, what do we know about the clinical trajectory for the athlete and using the biomarkers as a return to play protocol? Where are we on that field?
Yeah, I think that we are still lacking studies that actually explore the changes over time in players for certain sports. For sure, we have studies showing that biomarkers are elevated that normally correlate with the severity of the injury. And in some cases, they also evaluate longitudinal trajectories for normalization, but not large studies where we actually can observe or find significant patterns or groups within different sports. So I think that we need more studies. If we translate this to something that we know more about, that is traumatic brain injury, what we know is that even within individuals that have, for example, severe traumatic brain injury, there's a lot of clinical heterogeneity, not only in the way that they present, but also in the way that they progress. So meaning that you can have a group of 20 patients with traumatic brain injury, severe traumatic brain injury. All of them have clinically been assessed as severe traumatic brain injury. They all have different trajectories. Why? Because of the mechanisms of the injury, because of like physiological roles, gender, and also race play a big role in this case. So then what we need to know is that what are the risk groups that we have for individuals that have a concussion. Like it could be that certain individuals or certain ages are more susceptible to these concussions than others. So those things we still don't know yet, but we should know more about that soon.
Could that be? I just came to me right now. Could that be a risk factor, for example, in genetics heritage for Alzheimer's disease? I know. I talked to Niklas Marklund about this. What is called APOE?
APOE4. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us more about that? Is that something that you talk about that could be a factor influencing the post-concussion syndrome or risk of Alzheimer's disease, post-traumatic?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is also such a fascinating topic because APOE4 is something that is usually associated to an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in Caucasian populations. And then this is very, very important. Like most of the studies that we have on Alzheimer's disease, I mean, nowadays it's changing a lot, but most of the big studies, large studies that we have, mostly focus on Caucasian populations. So meaning that most of the conclusions are based on what we observe in these specific individuals. However, for example, APOE4 is not a risk factor for Afro descendants or people from Black communities. It's not such a big risk factor for them. In Asian populations, APOE4 is not necessarily a risk factor. They have a different form of APOE. So I think when it comes to APOE, it is difficult to generalize because what we are seeing is based on large studies on Caucasian individuals, but we need more diversity on these studies to just call it like this is 100% a risk factor of AD. I would say at this moment you can say that, but you need to put an asterisk on top of it. It's like this applies to these groups. So the same thing should be done with individuals that, for example, due to different genetic conditions, race, age, sex, could have a higher risk of developing sequels of TBI, like adverse conditions after TBI.
So even though you would maybe think or consider that APOE4 would be a risk factor for post-traumatic Alzheimer's disease, then you have to, I didn't know that. You have to consider that maybe it's not even a risk factor to begin with for some people.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Exactly. And also, I think that nowadays this is changing a bit because you have more studies that aim to include diverse population and then also aim to include different races and stuff like that. But this is just me complaining about some things because I've seen a bunch of studies that aim to compare populations. That, for example, aim to compare like clinical outcomes in patients with this condition in Caucasians versus, people from Latin America in the US. But then what we need to consider is that you are not comparing exactly under even circumstances, because what happens sometimes is that you compare a group that is highly educated, that have good socioeconomical conditions against a group that is, yes, of course, a different demographic group, but then they have poor socioeconomic conditions, less education. So I think that right now what we are also trying to do is to have studies, not only for Alzheimer's disease, but for many other conditions where we say like, okay, they are evenly matched when it comes to like socioeconomic conditions, education, and then where we are comparing is the effect of race and certain genetic factors in these two populations. So those things, I think that they are changing a bit. So when someone claims that this is a risk factor for this, based on previous publications, 100%, but based on more recent studies and then these new ideas, it might change with time.
That's good that you added that. And even though it's not the main focus within concussion field, then maybe it will be later. But first, if I understand you correctly, first we have to know the risk factor of for Alzheimer's disease to begin with, before talking about the risk factor for it in regards to concussion.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm not saying that, for example, previous publications or assumptions are wrong. I just say that this is limited to certain groups at the moment. So what we need is to expand and to extend our knowledge to say like, okay, what is definitely a risk factor in general and what is a risk factor for certain populations. So those things, I think, will be for sure something that we will have in the future.
Good point. But during your lecture in Gothenburg, I remember that you showed us some slides of athletes that had been knocked out, some concussed, and you showed us that even though they felt better after a few days or a few weeks, then some of the biomarkers of the brain injury was still increased for quite some time, for weeks, even many months. And I've talked to many people about that we know that symptoms can disappear. Clinical recovery can come before physiological recovery. We just don't know what measurement is the best. Is it this marker? And even though this marker is increased for many weeks and months, does it matter? Does that mean the next injury will be worse? Maybe it doesn't. What do we know about that? What markers are elevated for a long time, and is it clinically important? Is it used to say that no, you should not return to play as it now? What do we know about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go back again to the example of the building, just because the building is functional again, doesn't mean that you should start using it as you use it before, because maybe some areas are still under construction, and that is risky. So what I would say is that definitely clinical symptoms can disappear in some cases, but that is because there is this recovery phase that is like the clinical recovery of the patient. So you will see a clinical improvement over time, and then symptoms would disappear. But then that doesn't mean that, again, the inflammation process is over, and it doesn't mean that the brain has come back to its normal physiological state. As I mentioned, like these proteins need to go back to work the way they worked before the incident. And it takes time not only to get rid of all the mess after the injury, but it takes time to actually go back to physiological states. And in that sense, I think that biomarkers are extremely valuable. And then we should trust not only clinical symptoms, but also clinic changes in biomarkers that are clinically meaningful. So I would say that, for example, in this case, GFAP could be an excellent marker because, again, since it is capturing many aspects of the disease, it could be that acute neuronal injury is over, but then there could be still some inflammation, there could be some still vascular changes. So things that are still not 100% okay. We need to take that in consideration. With tau and NFL, they are also extremely useful because even if the patient doesn't have any symptoms, but the biomarkers remain high, it means that there is still a process. So it could be that, okay, maybe there is no longer a neuronal death, but the body is still trying to clear all the things that got released after the injury. So you should give the body time to actually finish with this job and then continue with your normal activities. So I think that they can be extremely useful as objective measurements. Because when it comes to clinical symptoms, remember that in the clinic, that the diagnostic is always syndromatic. When we evaluate a patient, it's a syndromatic diagnosis that we do. So in a way, this can vary depending on the patient, depending on the clinician, but biomarkers can be used as objective measurements of physiological and pathological process in this sense.
And that makes sense because if you could use the blood biomarkers as a objective measurement, then you could say, okay, even though you are feeling well, there is still a injury process that is the building is still recovering. But one of the slides that you showed, it showed after a massive concussive event, it took many months for these blood biomarkers to recover. Are we looking at that athletes should have a contact sport restriction for many months compared to only days and weeks as we have today? What do you think? Because if you told people that, they would be, it would be sound insane to them. I've been feeling well for many months, and you're still saying that I have a brain injury. How could that be?
Well, I think that goes beyond my abilities to say yes or no. What I would say is that patients should be informed about this. And then I don't know about the restrictions that should be imposed, or like if there should be a regulation. I don't know, to be honest. But I think that you should inform patients that it is up to you to decide what to do now. What we are observing, and this again goes back to the objective measurement, is that there is still something that is not 100% okay. Might be clinically relevant, might not be. We are not sure about this, but what we are observing is that there is still a physiological or pathological process in your brain based on the biomarker measurements. You decide. You should be the one deciding in this case.
But do we know how much it matters to have a baseline? For example, for one of the boxers that you mentioned on one of your slides, could the results be due to that he or she had a high baseline measurement, or what do we know about that?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and it goes back to one of the points that we measure, that is the biological variation of these markers. So yeah, 100% agree with your point that since for most of these individuals, we don't have a baseline as a reference, it could be that physiologically there is nothing wrong with them, but there is like a biological variation of these markers that for certain conditions, we have a term that is called hyperproducers, that is like in physiological conditions, this individual just happens to produce more of this, but it is potentially not harmful or pathological. So we are not sure about that. So that's why having a reference, like a baseline before, in this case, I think it's pretty much possible with sports, because you have individuals that are not just arriving to the emergency room after an incident, but you have individuals that will plan to participate in this event. So then it is possible to use that. So I would say that, yeah, we are not sure 100% of like if this changes in biomarkers after a year. I think that's the slide that I showed, that after a year, some individuals were still high, but having a baseline could be very valuable in this case.
So, for example, if you took blood samples of ice hockey players, the whole team, and then you could use that maybe in the future, as a guideline for return to play, and to tell when the player has come down to his original baseline levels. But we know that the biomarkers, the building blocks that could be measured, could be shown to be increased a long time after clinical and symptom recovery. But we don't know, for example, if you recover symptomatically within 2 or 3 weeks, and the biomarkers takes 3 or 4 months, let's say, just for an example, to recover, we still don't know if it's more dangerous to have a new concussive event 2 or 3 months post-injury compared to 6 months post-injury. So is that correct? We still don't know how dangerous it is to get a new concussion while the
biomarkers are still increased. Is that how you...
Yes, exactly. So I would say that if the biomarker is still increased, there is a process in the brain. Most likely, if it is after a couple of months, most likely it's not going to be due to neuronal death, but it's most likely related to the dysmetabolism of these proteins. So there is a process that is still not 100% solved that makes the biomarker to continue to be high. So if you have that biomarker increase, that is like a red sign, like there is something happening. Maybe it's just part of the recovery process, or maybe it's just an active damage. So we are not sure of that. I would say that many people would appreciate to have that information. Just saying like, look, I can tell you that clinically you have recovered, that everything seems to be okay when it comes to clinical evaluation. But then there's still this tiny little thing that bothers me, that is that you still have these increased levels. So you have the information, now you decide what to do with that. In that sense, my suggestion based on evidence is this.
That's a very good way to put it, from what we know today.
Yeah.
Because just to remember tell the listeners again, you mentioned that these biomarkers could be increased due to the actual injury, but it, as you said, it could be maybe that the neurons has recovered, but the biomarkers are still increased due to a recovery process or a handling of the former injury. So we just don't know. Don't know.
Yeah, again, if we go back to the example of the building, just because it looks normal again doesn't mean that inside of the building there is not a lot of chaos and mess still. So yeah, it looks fine. Clinically, it seems like the patient has recovered. But again, the biomarkers are signatures of a process. And then if this is not fully back to normal, let's say, assuming that you have a baseline, then it means that something is still under construction there.
So what you and your research colleagues would need is that you need a baseline of many players. You need concussed players that recover quickly and go back and get concussed again. We don't have that data, I think, but is that what you would need to know what happens after you get multiple concussions?
What I would say is that, yeah, we need all those things that you mentioned, but then we need longitudinal studies with many individuals. So we need, and this, I think, it's a matter of logistics, because people keep continuing practicing these sports and they continue get reconcussed. So the problem is that, I mean, not that I know, but we don't have these large observational longitudinal studies where you can just take samples from these individuals at baseline and then just let them continue with like their activities and then evaluate. I think that at this point what we need is a lot of clinical information on these patients, because also just saying that we have a group of concussed individuals, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. Not all of these individuals have the same age, the same weight, the same characteristics. So there will be a lot of variation. So it will be difficult to draw meaningful conclusions, because you can just draw conclusions in a group level, but then the more patients you have, the more specific you can be with your questions. So I think that we need large observational studies. We need studies that actually provide a lot of clinical information and changes over time. And also, of course, we need good biomarkers for this.
And for that research to be accomplished, what is in the pipeline, to say? Where do you think you and your colleagues in Gothenburg will go the next couple of years? Because from what I understand, Sweden is quite good at this biomarkers measuring compared to many other countries.
Yeah. I think that definitely, not to brag about that, but the Gothenburg University, I think, is at the top when it comes to biomarkers worldwide. that is also thanks to Professor Kai Bleno and then his amazing work when it comes to blood biomarkers. I'm saying that because he's my boss, of course. So I have to
Maybe
mention
he'll
him.
listen to this. Hopefully,
I don't think so. I don't think so. But if he does, Kai, I'm promoting the lab. No, but I think that what we normally do is that we focus a lot on developing novel blood-based biomarkers, improving the ones that we have, developing new biomarkers. I would say that maybe the limitation that we have is that we don't have these cohorts, this type of cohorts or this type of samples. So then it would be great if some people, I mean, in your audience or like anyone that likes to collaborate and then will feel like, okay, we can definitely plan a study like this. I mean, we would be happy to collaborate. From our side, what we are doing is that we are trying to develop more biomarkers that are better than previous generations. So that is one thing. Of course, our focus is Alzheimer's disease, but as I always say, these are not Alzheimer's disease biomarkers. These are brain biomarkers. And part of also the research that I have done over the last couple of years is showing that these biomarkers, one, have a physiological role, and then they are very important in physiology, but also that they can be clinically meaningful in other conditions. Sometimes people get like disappointed when they see like, oh, but this biomarker that we thought that it was very AD specific, it happens to be also increase in other conditions. It's not about when it is high or low, but what is the clinical meaning of this? Because in the end, the way that we use biomarkers should be always focused on like the clinical symptomatology. Clinic should guide biomarker investigation, not the other way around, in my opinion. So I think that that's what we're doing. We're trying to get new things, test these new things across conditions, but we are lacking this type of cohorts. So it would be great if we collaborate.
That's a good way to put it. We don't need, in particular, Alzheimer's-specific biomarkers. We don't only need concussion-specific biomarkers. We need brain injury-specific biomarkers. And when you combine that with a clinical setting, if it's an Alzheimer's patient or a concussed patient, then you can use it. So it's not bad, as I understand you. It's not bad that it's a not only Alzheimer's biomarker. It can be. It's good that it can be used in many other diseases. If I understand you.
That thing that you say that we don't need AD-specific biomarkers could be taken as a blasphemy in the field, because people will claim that, no, we really need AD-specific biomarkers. But the more you investigate these proteins, you get to understand that they are not specific of a disease, but they are specific of different pathways in the brain. So they are specific of different pathological processes in the brain. And these pathological processes are shared by many conditions. Some of them are more strongly associated than others with these biomarkers. For example, I always mention like phospho-tau. It has become like the most popular biomarker in Alzheimer's disease, but we have seen that it's not 100% AD specific. There are other conditions that can increase this biomarker in when you don't have Alzheimer's disease. But I would say that if you have a patient with cognitive complaints that is above 65 years old, and then it happens to have high levels of phospho-tau in blood, most likely this is going to be Alzheimer's disease because of the prevalence of the condition, but also because the marker is strongly associated to this condition. So we shouldn't be disappointed of biomarkers not be 100% specific. What we need to do is to understand what kind of information they provide. Why are they increased in these conditions?
That's a good way to put it. So right now, when you don't have a specific marker, you have to combine it with the clinical setting to tell the diagnosis and maybe also prognosis.
Yeah, I mean, people, depending on who you ask, they might tell you like, we do have AD-specific biomarkers. I'm the type of person that believes that there are no specific biomarkers for conditions. There are biomarkers for pathological processes in the brain. So then clinical investigation should always guide biomarker interpretation. So there's this strong idea of like, well, maybe biomarkers should replace a clinical assessment. And I think that is a really risky thing to do. Is, as you mentioned, like, would you decide what to do just based on a biomarker with a player, or it is difficult to tell. So I think that we should aim to combine clinics with biomarkers and then just get the best for the patient.
That's a good way to put it. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you would like the listeners to know in regards to this field?
I think that many new things are coming when it comes to blood biomarkers. I think that it is a very exciting time to be a researcher in this area. I think that the only thing that I would like to mention is that, so, for example, in the Alzheimer's field, we have new therapies for Alzheimer's disease that there's a large discussion on the approval of these drugs or not. So there are many things there, and people are mentioning like how important having blood biomarkers nowadays is when you have therapies. But then I would say not only with Alzheimer's disease, but also with brain-related injury. Yeah, we should have more biomarkers, but we need to be very careful the way that we interpret these biomarkers, because just because a biomarker seems to perform good, it shouldn't replace, again, clinical evaluation. And we should always aim to have like a good overview. The patient is not the biomarker itself. The patient is a patient. So a biomarker is only a tiny part of the disease. So we should aim to have good biomarkers, but also to understand them in the clinical context for this.
A very nuanced way of saying it, and if I may, I would like to borrow the house or building analogy that you've been using. I think it's a perfect way of telling people more about this, because people are wondering, what does this mean with the biomarkers? And people, as you said, people are worried about Alzheimer's disease. After post-traumatic events, but you sound optimistic when it comes to the future of Alzheimer's treatment.
That depends. For political reasons, I think it's better not to deep into that. I think that so the way that I see it, I mean, we focus on diagnostics, and in a way that is not exactly, or people might say like, well, the way that diagnostic and therapeutics relate is that you need good diagnostic markers to start therapy, right? Like that is the way that we interact. But I think that it's more than that, because the more you understand these biomarkers, the more you understand what is happening in the brain, and you can get insights on like, okay, if this is what is happening in the brain, maybe also biomarker discovery can guide drug development. So right now, I think that we have certain drugs, and then in the future we might have new drugs, but then maybe biomarkers can also give us insights of like what is happening in the brain based on the levels of the things that we can measure, and can we use this information to develop new strategies. So I think that I'm optimistic in a sense that we are working very hard to discover new things when it comes to the brain and the way it works, and in the future we will probably have even more things to share.
And I'm looking forward to. It's good to hear that you're optimistic about the sideline evaluation, that we shouldn't bet against the technology, and that.
No, don't never do that.
No, I won't. And hopefully, it could be used as a screening tool, sideline evaluation for concussion, maybe, and hopefully soon, but also maybe also in the clinical setting and decision of returning to play. I think it's been very informative, and I would like to, me and the listeners would like to thank you for your time and participating, taking us through this journey.
Thank you for the invitation. And I mean, if there is anything that I can help with, I hope that you can also contact me again. You have my information, and then I will be happy to collaborate.
If others want to collaborate with you, how did they reach out to you? Is it Googling your name? They find your email on Gothenburg University?
Maybe you experience that if you put my name on Google, I mean, there are like hundreds of people with my name, so maybe not the easiest way. So if you can just put my name in Gothenburg University, I think that so far I'm the only Fernando Gonzalez in Gothenburg University. There's a music producer, and then there's even a guy in Stockholm that is TV guy or something that has my same name. So maybe just put my name and Gothenburg University, and then that should be it.
If they Google Alzheimer's disease afterwards as well, then they most likely will find you.
Maybe.
But I will put a link to your profile on Gothenburg University under the podcast at least, and I would like to invite you again
for sure
at some point in the future. And thank you very, very much for participating. Fernando.
You,
it's
Victor.
been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.